or not for you if you haven't taken a break and you're just doing this straight through. This is our Unit 3 midterm review. It's on ecology and important ecological concepts that weren't covered in Unit 1 or Unit 2. These are them. Let's get to it. So generalists and specialist species are the first topic. Generalist species generally can live in a wide variety of habitats. They have a wide variety of food resources that they can take advantage of. They have a broad ecological tolerance. They can live in a wide variety of ecological conditions. And generally, you see these have a advantage in changing environments. So we end up seeing more generalist species in human impacted areas, so in urban areas or anywhere where there's a lot of human impacts, because that environment is changing so quickly. As opposed to specialist species that have a very narrow niche. They have a narrow range of habitats, a narrow range of resources that they can take advantage of. And so they do better in environments that are not changing, where they can just take advantage. They know exactly what they need. They can get those few things. They have that very narrow range, and they live in that narrow range. If they are pushed out of that narrow range, they will survive. So they will not survive. So you end up with a greater number of endangered species being specialist species. That's the general trend that we see. Okay, so there's different. So R and K selection is a description of reproductive strategies. So when you think about specialists and generalists, we're talking about things that we see for ways to gain resources, and K and R are reproductive strategies. So K selected are reproductive strategies that will keep you close to K, or carrying capacity. So if you are a population that is trying to stay towards your carrying capacity, you're going to end up being large in physical size. Think about a gorilla versus a snail, large in physical size. You have few offspring per reproductive event. You're generally trying to maintain a stable population. So you're not reproducing a lot of individuals at once. You're reproducing few individuals per reproductive bout. You have a lot of parental care because you have the energy for each offspring, because you're not having that many of them. It takes many years to mature to reach reproductive strategy, and you end up in reproductive maturity, and you spend that time under parental care. Longer lifespan, you reproduce multiple times over your lifespan. You're living in stable environments. That makes sense because you're hanging out around carrying capacity, or K. You end up with a high competition for resources, and generally generally K species are specialist species because they're living close to their carrying capacity, and so they're doing whatever they can to just kind of maintain that current population size. Now, reproductive strategy opposite of K is R, which R we can think of a rapid rate of reproduction, or rapid reproduction. So these guys are not hanging out around carrying capacity. They are going to be fluctuating wildly around their carrying capacity because they're not controlling for population growth. So generally they're small, they're reproducing a lot of offspring. They're not putting a lot of energy into each offspring, so low parental care. They're maturing early, and they're reproducing maybe only once in their lifetime. They thrive generally in disturbed habitats because they come in and they just boom, reproduce quickly. Generally, they're invasive species because they go in and they just reproduce really quickly. And they are usually also generalists because they can take advantage of a wide variety of food. We generally see exponential growth when all populations start off and they're in a new habitat where they're able to survive, where they increase really quickly. And then we see the differences between R and K once they're established, because they all initially see that exponential growth. Do they just continue fluctuating wildly around carrying capacity, as you see in R, or do they hang out around carrying capacity, what we see in K, where they have a stable reproductive growth? Classifying can be tricky. Generally, you're not going to just have only K strategies or only R strategies. You're going to have a combination of both. So most species have both R and K strategies, but they're more one or the other. For the exam, for AP and for mine, it should be pretty clear which one it is. We're looking for you to be able to differentiate between our R and K strategies. So the way that they reproduce impacts their reproductive curve, their survivorship curves, how organisms are surviving over the length of their lifespan. Do we have relatively little death at the beginning of life and then a lot of death at the end of their life? That's what you see generally in K-selected species or type 1 species. You generally live out almost most of the individuals survive until the end. You have your greatest death rate at the very end of your lifespan. Are selected, you end up with the greatest amount of death at the beginning of your lifespan. And once you survive maybe to 25% of your lifespan, not many individuals are left, but they will survive. So think about things like tree germination. Most of the seeds that are produced by trees never germinate, and if they do, they don't survive to sapling or reproductive maturity. So that's a beautiful example of type 3, as opposed to us, which is a wonderful example of type 1. Generally, we see the highest amount of death at the end of our lifespan instead of at the beginning. There are certain organisms that have consistent death rate over their life. That's called type 2. Hydra, a type of invertebrate, exemplifies that type of reproduction, and also birds are generally type 2. So I've been talking a lot about carrying capacity. K, what is carrying capacity? Carrying capacity is the maximum population size that a habitat can support. And when a population is below the carrying capacity, the population is going to increase towards that carrying capacity. And if the population is above carrying capacity, the population is going to decrease towards carrying capacity. Generally, once you're at carrying capacity, which we see this K selected as a logistic growth around carrying capacity, it doesn't hit carrying capacity and just stay there. If you have a population of elephants, and let's say the carrying capacity is 10,000, once it hits 10,000, it's not going to be like, all right, elephants, we have to now, every individual must, like every couple has 2 babies just to replicate themselves. That's not how it's going to be. A population can't just maintain exact carrying capacity. They fluctuate around carrying capacity. When you exceed carrying capacity greatly, you will run out of resources, which lead to generally famine, disease, if it's human populations or not, higher rates of conflict, and then your population will decrease generally below carrying capacity, and then when you're below it, you'll increase back up because you have an excess of resources, which lead to an excess of reproduction, and then you'll just continue that cycle into perpetuity. If you have a higher amount of resources, you're going to have a higher carrying capacity. If you have less resources, you're going to have a lower carrying capacity. And by you, I mean if the habitat has more resources. Generally, a population can't keep growing at that maximum biotic potential. You see the biggest population growth when you're halfway to carrying capacity, because you have enough individuals to reproduce really quickly. So you end up with that highest rate right at your half carrying capacity, but you can't stay at that growth rate because you will quickly deplete your resources. So what limits your growth rate? There's 2 types of growth limiting factors. They can be density dependent, meaning that they have a stronger influence when the population is at a certain level. So there are things like competition, predation, parasitism that have an increasing influence on the population as the population becomes bigger, as opposed to density independent factors which affect the population regardless of the population density. So a storm might kill a greater number of individuals if there are more individuals, but it's going to have an impact regardless of the size or density. So generally, natural disasters or weather events are impactful regardless of the density of the population. It doesn't matter the size of the population, it's going to have that same impact. So population growth is determined by available resources. And if you have unlimited resources, you're going to grow at an exponential rate following a J-shaped curve. However, at some point you are going to run out of your resources because resources are limited, they are finite. And when you start to encounter that limited resource, now you're going to start to grow a logistic growth curve. You're going to approach carrying capacity and kind of fluctuate around carrying capacity. And potentially you are going to be limited by density dependent factors as well as density independent factors. Where if you are growing exponentially, you're probably only going to be limited by your density independent factors. Fecundity is the ability to produce offspring. As population increases, our fecundity decreases, and as population increases and resources become scarce, you're also going to have a lower fecundity. So how do we show age and our trends, our population sizes in a population? We show our age structure through these population pyramids. The x-axis is our number of individuals, or the proportion of our population that fall into our Y, our age group. So we split up our age groups into three main categories. Pre-reproductive from ages 0 to 14, which is the bottom of the age structure pyramid. Our reproductive ages are 15 to 14. This is for humans, but you can do this for any type. The ages I'm giving are for humans, but you can do age structure pyramids for any population that you have this type of data for. And reproductive means you're actively adding to the population. And then post-reproductive is 46 plus. And of course, if you're doing a different animal, you're gonna have different ages. But you can split this up into your three big cohorts: before your reproductive, at reproductive, and post-reproductive. So let's look at what those shapes tell us about how a population is growing. So if you have, like here, a really bottom heavy population, that means you're growing quickly. Basically, you have a very large pre-reproductive age group, and if your largest percent of your population is pre-reproductive, that means your population is going to be reproducing longer and you're going to be making more offspring over time. Generally, populations that show this bottom heavy structure are a developing nation. They have less economic stability and a younger workforce. If you have a middle heavy, like what we see in B and C, where it's middle heavy, this means we have a smaller reproductive age group, and your reproductive ages are basically of similar reproduction. You're just reproducing what's already there, so you're maintaining a constant population size. And this is what we see in like well-developed or better economic stability countries. If you're top heavy, your population is declining. You are not reproducing enough. You're not reproducing enough to replenish your current population size. You'll see generally a large older population. A larger percentage of your population is post-reproductive. You're economically and socially developed. You have a lot of higher education. Generally, women are waiting longer to make babies. The issue here with a declining human population is that you're going to have less individuals paying taxes as time goes on. So you're going to have less resources being able to be provided by your government. So long-term social services can be impacted in that way. We can look at total fertility rate, and we can look at it with those age structure pyramids as well. The total fertility rate is the average number of children a woman will have during her childbearing years, and this is overall an average rate. To the right, I show a graph of the U.S. fertility rate from 1933 to 2006. Nope, it says 2016. And we are now just a little bit below 2, which means that a woman and her partner will not fully be replacing themselves. So we're at a stable age structure pyramid. If that number is above 2, you're going to have a more bottom heavy. And if it's much less than 2, it's going to be more top heavy. So we can think about how all these things impact our population pyramids. What impacts fertility rate, what impacts how many offspring a woman is going to be having, is the age at first pregnancy. The younger the age, the greater the total fertility rate, because the higher number of babies a woman will potentially be having. The amount and a number of educational opportunities for women. As we see increased education in women, we see they're having less babies. Our total fertility rate is going down. Increased family planning and access to family planning decreases total fertility rate. And there are certain governmental policies that can also decrease total fertility rate, like in China, they had a one child policy for a little while, and that also impacted the total fertility rate. So these things, so what impacts how a population will grow? What impacts how a population will grow is your reproductive rate, your birth rate, and your death rate. So what impacts whether the birth rate will be greater than the death rate is education, infant mortality, age of marriage, and nutrition. And so I put how each of these rates will impact population growth. So if you are exceeding your carrying capacity, for humans, you are going to experience conflict, famine, and potentially death. And we can see how long it takes for a population to double by the number of years it takes to double is equal to 70 over the annual percentage growth rate. So if I give you the annual percentage growth rate, I fully expect you to tell me how long it will take to double. So if I tell you that the annual percentage growth rate is 7%, then you do 70 divided by 7. You keep it in a full number, and that is about 10 years for your population to double. You will need to do this on the midterm. You will need to do this on the AP exam. So be ready to use rule of 70. I'm not going to have you, be ready to use rule of 70. So all of these things, our total fertility rate, our birth rate, our death rate, our population growth rate, and our age structure pyramids all come together, and we can figure out demographic transition, or we can start to think about how this impacts demographic transition. So demographic transition are basically these trends that we see in birth rate, death rate, and total population growth rate that tell us how developed our country is, or how developed a country is, and what goes along with that. So in phase 1 or stage 1, this is pre-industrial, you see it's mostly an agricultural based ecosystem economy with a younger population. So these are developing countries. We see high infant mortality, and children are generally needed in the workforce. You have a high birth rate, but that's coupled also with a high death rate. When you have a high birth rate and a high death rate, you end up with a stable population size. So your population is stabilized by having a very high death rate. Phase 2 is transitional. So we now see improved sanitation. We're moving towards developing. So we're still potentially agricultural based, but we're starting to see increase in medicine. So we have that high birth rate still, but our death rate is decreasing. So we see an increasing population growth. In stage 3, now we've also increased our education levels. So we see a lower infant mortality and a decreasing birth rate, because whenever we have increasing education, that's generally coupled with decreasing fertility rates. So now our population growth is starting to slow as women start to enter the workforce. And our last stage was stage 4. Now our birth rate is low, our death rate is low, so you can have a 0 or potentially even a negative growth rate. We have high levels of education, very low levels of infant mortality, potentially older populations with a bigger tax burden on the young. Okay, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out, and we will talk soon.